Okay, calcium homeostasis. So homeostasis is the word that means striking a balance or keeping internal conditions more or less the same, even as external conditions change. So it's good to remind ourselves what homeostasis means because it's easy to lose sight of that. As you know, all the new terms and ideas are sort of whizzing around in your head. So hopefully somebody can tell me what the biggest reservoir for calcium is in the body. Where is most of your calcium stored?
In your bones.
In your bones is correct. So you can think of the bones as being sort of like a bank. And from this bank, your body can make deposits and withdrawals, just like a regular bank account, right? So if you need some, you make a withdrawal. If you are flush with calcium, you can put some away for later. So just to remind us why calcium is important, I'm going to make a little box over here. And that's just going to remind us why we even worry about this and why it's an important homeostatic thing to consider. So I'm going to say Ca2 plus uses. If you remember from the heart chapter, you might recall that the cardiomyocyte potential has a big plateau in it, and that's mediated by calcium. So let's say cardiac muscle function. That's one thing. Another thing is skeletal muscle function and smooth muscle. I'm abbreviating function as being FN, right? So you might remember from smooth muscle function, calmodulin complexes with calcium, and that kicks off the cross-bridge cycle in smooth muscle. In skeletal muscle, you release a bunch of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum, and that is what spurs the beginning of the excitation contraction cycle. So you can't do any of this stuff without calcium. You also can't do neurotransmitter release. So once the action potential gets to the end of the axon, the way that it's transmitting to the next cell is voltage-gated calcium channels on the axon terminus open up, and the influx of calcium to the axon terminus is what causes vesicles of neurotransmitter to fuse with the membrane and release the neurotransmitter. So if you don't have enough calcium, your neurotransmitter release is going to be impaired. So the reason I made this box red is to call attention to it and just say, hey, calcium is a central ion in so many things that support life and staying alive. So that should help drive home the idea that if there is an imbalance in calcium, stuff starts to go wrong really quickly. The one that clinically is, the one we worry about the most is the top one, heart muscle function. But calcium irregularities do affect other systems as well. So this means that the concentration of calcium in the blood is closely regulated by the body. So that requires withdrawals and deposits into and out of our calcium bank. So let's take a walk down memory lane, and hopefully you can remember some of the cells in bone. So bone is a crystalline matrix of calcium phosphate mixed with collagen, and there's living cells that are part of that structure that keep your bones healthy. So who can name a bone cell?
Osteocyte.
Bingo, osteocytes, yes.
Osteoblasts.
Osteoblasts, perfect.
Osteoclast.
And osteoclasts, those are the main ones. Hooray. Okay, so I'm actually going to give myself more space here. So I'm going to put osteoblasts above osteocytes because an osteoblast is just an osteocyte that is not grown up yet. So when osteoblasts completely surround themselves with bony matrix, then they're considered osteocytes. And then osteoclasts. So osteocytes are going to lay down new bone matrix. And osteoclasts break down the bone matrix. So going back to our analogy of the bones being a calcium bank, this domain represents deposit, and this domain represents a withdrawal, right? So if I'm low on blood calcium and I need some, I can have osteoclasts scavenge some from my bones. So they can go in, they can spit acid and enzymes onto my bone, which is going to degrade some of the bony matrix and release some of the calcium from my bones, which is handy because that gets me through my calcium deficiency in a pinch. If I have lots and lots of calcium, maybe I've been eating lots of calcium-rich foods, like dark leafy greens, for example, maybe I'm going to say, okay, well, I have extra calcium in my blood. I can put some of this into my bones. So there's really constantly a sort of push and pull situation going on between your skeleton and your bones, where small withdrawals and deposits are being made all the time so that your blood calcium is at an appropriate level. So far, we've talked about a bunch of muscular systems as well as the nervous system. And we've talked about blood and we've talked about bones. So there's a bunch of different systems going on here, and we're going to add more now. So I'm going to make a little matrix or flow chart, and we're going to fill it in together. Just give me 1 minute to draw all my boxes and then we'll flesh this out. Move. There we go. All right, so there's no good place for me to put my epic pen thing. All right, so we have some boxes and some flow charts. So what I'm trying to get you to do is think about when blood calcium drops or when blood calcium rises, what sequence of events is going to help to set that right. And this is just a very basic framework. There's sort of an additional layer that we'll talk about after we do this. So I'll give you a hint. In each of these boxes is a gland, and in each of these boxes is a hormone. So let's start up here. If blood calcium drops, that means that we need to make a withdrawal from our calcium bank, right? So think back. What hormone is going to act to increase blood calcium? So now we're integrating the endocrine system into our discussion because that's how this is modulated.
Parathyroid.
Bingo, parathyroid hormone, yep. So I'm gonna say PTH because I don't have much room in my box. That stands for parathyroid hormone. So by virtue of PTH, the gland is therefore the and then over here in our cells box, these are the bone cells that PTH would act on to make blood calcium go from being too low back up. So would that be osteoblasts, osteoclasts, or osteocytes?
Osteoclast.
Osteoclasts is perfect, yes. So PTH is going to say, hey, osteoclasts, I need you to dissolve some of the bone so we can get calcium back into the blood. So let's go down here and look at the opposite situation. So what hormone would you expect to see released in response to blood calcium that was too high?
I mean, thyroid hormone.
Nope, not quite. I'll give you guys a hint. This particular hormone tones down blood calcium. Emphasis on the word tone.
I remember thyroid and parathyroid work opposite.
Is aldosterone?
Nope. It's the one everyone always forgets. I'll write it.
Calcitonin.
So remember, calcitonin comes from the parafollicular cells, so the little clumps of cells between the thyroid follicles. And it does come from the thyroid gland, but it's not thyroid hormone. It's its own thing.
I thought like it will belong to thyroid gland, so it's gonna be thyroid hormone.
No, thyroid hormone is a hormone that does something completely different. So it's not simply belonging to the thyroid gland that makes something thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is thyroxine, and that's a metabolic alterer, not anything to do with calcium homeostasis directly. So if I want to put a deposit into my calcium bank, what cells am I going to act on to make that happen?
Osteoblast.
Osteoblasts and or osteocytes, both. They both exist in different populations in your bones. So I would accept either answer for that.
So they're not the same, are they? Or are they just, is it like osteocytes are osteoblasts, but osteoblasts aren't osteocytes? Is that kind of like what's going on there?
Not quite. It's rather that, so an osteoblast is a baby osteocyte. It's just not mature yet.
Okay, so what's the difference in as far as osteoblasts? Do they have different functions because
Nope, they do not.
Osteocytes? Oh, okay.
Not really anyway. An osteoblast is just a bone cell that deposits new matrix, but it hasn't walled itself off completely in bone yet. So if it's like sitting on a bony surface, but it's not completely surrounded by bone matrix, then it's still an osteoblast. It's an osteocyte once it is enclosed in a lacuna.
Okay, okay. So that lacuna basically differentiates if it's an osteocyte or an osteoblast.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so you guys did really well at that. That was awesome. So for the most part, you successfully and with relative ease filled in the boxes. So this is helping you link the endocrine system to the bone cells and how that acts on calcium homeostasis. So now we have to build in an additional topic because I find that students sort of get this next thing mixed up. So let's look at So I'm going to ask you some questions about calcitriol. So 1, so 1 is, where does it come from ultimately in your body?
Kidneys.
But before that, you couldn't make it if you didn't have
Vitamin D.
correct. And where is that?
Skin.
Bingo, skin. So sunlight plus skin, ultimately, after conversion by the liver and kidneys, gives you calcitriol. So I'm going to write some conversion steps in here. I'm not going to recapitulate the whole vitamin D cycle on this particular video. So if you want a review of that, well, that'll have to be at another time because it's too much to build into this. But there are some conversion steps in there involving the liver and the kidney, as you may recall from Biology 241. So once calcitriol is circulating, which 2 organ systems does it act on? And I want to stress here, this is something that students have been kind of missing throughout this entire term. So for example, for some of the practical questions, I asked, identify the hormone that acts on the thing in the picture. Acts on means the hormone lands on that tissue and does something to it to change its function. So I'm not asking you in this question where calcitriol comes from or how it's produced. I'm asking you what it does, what its function is. Specifically, which 2 organ systems does it change the function of?
Doesn't it affect the digestive tract?
It does. That's one of them. So let's write that down. Very good. And there's another one, and I'll give you a hint. It's another one of the ones that you
Urinary
just
system.
learned. Yes, the urinary system. Perfect. So in the digestive tract, it increases calcium absorption, and in the urinary system, it acts on the renal tubule to decrease calcium loss in the urine.
So I'm looking at it and it also says like the calcitriol part of it, the whole little diagram in chapter 5, that it stimulates calcium and phosphate ion absorption. Is that both in the digestive tract it does that?
Yeah, so hydroxyapatite, which is what your bone crystal, that's the name for the mineral. Is a crystal, so a particular solid shape of calcium phosphate.
Okay, makes sense.
So it's both calcium and phosphate, but we're talking about calcium homeostasis specifically right now, so I'm focusing on that. But yes, phosphate is also important. The reason that phosphate isn't managed as tightly as calcium is is because phosphate is more abundant and more available. So it's easy to get phosphate. It's not as easy to get calcium. So the focal point of your homeostasis purposes is mostly focused on calcium rather than on phosphate.
Okay, that makes sense.
So in other parts of biology, we would call that a limiting nutrient. So calcium doesn't tend to be a limiting nutrient, or excuse me, phosphate doesn't tend to be a limiting nutrient to the same extent that calcium is.